So technological developments in the radiology practice change the way medical images and related data is produced and managed. The full digital transition of radiology departments and the ongoing transition in pathology require new technologies for image process, storage, and distribution. That's why in this seminar today, Bram Stieltjes will discuss how information from imaging can be reorganized for research purposes, what can be found in structured header information such as DICOM, where other important imaging-related data may reside, and how it can be extracted. Bram Stieltjes is Vice Chair of Research of the Department of Radiology and heads the Comprehensive Digital Diagnostic Department Group at the University Hospital Basel. After medical school in Rotterdam, Nottingham, Baltimore, and Heidelberg, Bram trained in radiology, radiation therapy, and child psychiatry at the German National Cancer Center and the Heidelberg University Hospital. There, Bram also formed and led the quantitative imaging-based disease characterization group, an interdisciplinary group between physics, computer science, and radiology. Based on research within this group, he obtained a PhD in the field of image analysis from the Leiden University. In 2014, Bram Stieltjes moved to Basel, where he now works on hospital-wide data integration and extraction in a clinical context for both research and diagnostic purposes. With this, I'm pleased to give the floor to Dr. Bram Stieltjes. Thank you, Bram.
Thanks, Sylvia. Good afternoon. Yeah, I got the request to talk about DICOM in the beginning. And so I will do that, but I'll also, as Sylvia introduced already, talk a little bit more about what else is there in radiology. Because DICOM is basically an industry standard for communication and formatting of images and other medical information that was set up. I think the first draft of it was in '82 or '85. And as with many standards, some get followed and some don't. And in the beginning, actually, it was not really taking off a lot. Each vendor had their own way of formatting their images, and over time, there was more and more pressure on these vendors to kind of adhere to this standard. But DICOM, although it is widely used in radiology, so it means MRI, CT, ultrasound, actually also gives a format for other clinical information, but it's actually rarely used in that context. So I will go into that in a few seconds. And I thought I might want to expand today a little bit beyond DICOM and also share with you what other interesting information is where in radiology and how can we maybe get it out for instance, research purposes. So maybe as a first step, it's good to kind of talk about the very big elements in a radiology IT landscape. So first of all, we have even within radiology at least two silos called the RIS, or Radiological Information System. In there may reside reports, like the doctor's reports, but also the patient's visits and the whole scheduling, but also which doctor is doing which report, or which has done which report, and who has read it out. And then the PACS, or Picture Archiving and Communication System, is the, let's say, the server where usually the images reside, and they are often stored in the DICOM format. And there's a DICOM header in the PACS that describes a lot of features that I'll go into in a second. And it's called a Picture Archiving and Communication System because oftentimes on top of this server, you also have a graphical user interface for image interpretation and reading of the studies. And then when you read it as a doctor, then whatever Word file you create gets saved in the radiological information system. So already there you have a little bit of a scattering of the data. And then these reports, well, I had to learn that as well, is that if you don't create a flat text, but say, okay, this is the introduction, and this is this body part and that body part. In medicine, people think this is already a structured report, although it's still a flat text. And I had to learn that there are 4 levels of structured reporting, and the first 2, to me, are still extremely unstructured, and we are hardly at level 1 or 2, and we're not doing very bad. So basically that means you have a flat text that states which organ group or region is being reported, and that's the way it is kind of separated out. But it means if you're really looking for some specific information, it is in an unstructured piece of text. And then the images in themselves are also unstructured in the sense that, well, we know their format and we know their intensities, but usually only a fraction of all the imaging elements, or voxels as they are called, because they're 3-dimensional in radiology, contain medically relevant information. Like if you have a tumor infiltrating somewhere, this infiltrating somewhere is maybe 5 voxels out of millions that you have in a whole data set. And it's described in a text that is at best referring to the slice. You know, the whole data is kind of sliced up. So you have a very weak correlation of what is in the text and where it is happening in the image. And measurements are rarely done in clinical practice. Although there are a lot of scores that depend on measurements, they are either guesstimated or, well, not reported, because it's extra work to draw a line here, draw a line there. So if there's not a lot of pressure on me to provide this line, I just don't measure it. And then it's lacking. So whereas you on the one hand see a lot of, let's say in trials, especially clinical trials, you see measurements or complex measurements that are used in these studies to maybe predict something. Then if you look at medical data, it's at best in an unstructured form in this piece of text. So that's why I would say it's scattered and unstructured. So let's first go to the happy part of the talk. It's the structured part. So what is in DICOM for images? And with that, I really mean what is in the DICOM header of an image, right? So DICOM also describes a protocol for exchange of the data, but here I'm just talking about pieces of or images that are stored in the .dcm format. And that means you have the image as itself, and then you have a header that describes actually more than you might think. So it does describe in point 2 the image related data that says something about the matrix, the resolution of the data, and how this data is oriented in space. You know, in radiology, we turn right and left around, and you have to know what is top and bottom. So there are different coordinate systems saved in the DICOM header. There's the scanner coordinate system and the real world's coordinate system. So that are all image-related data. But actually, we save quite some demographic data in the DICOM header, like the patient's name, their age, because they are relevant for instance, for dose calculations before we do a scan. Or for the amount of energy that we can deposit when we do an MRI scan. So we need weight, we need age, and this is actually before the patient gets scanned, is put in by the technician and gets all written into these DICOM forms. When some medications are also put in the DICOM header, not very we don't put chemotherapy in there, but there is anti-allergic medication that we sometimes have to give when we give contrast agent for the exam. That gets put there, and the contrast agent itself gets inserted in the DICOM header as well. And then when we do those scans, we sometimes measure the breathing pattern or the heartbeat to trigger the exams on the heartbeat. And then these physiological measures also get written into the DICOM header. So in a sense, you know, when you first look at it, it could be quite boring to just have the imaging format. But actually, if you look at it, quite a lot of things can be in a DICOM header as well. So if you need data that you would find difficult to get, then the DICOM header could be a surprising source of data. Then what may also be in the DICOM format and may be helpful is 3D structures. There's something called DICOM RT, radiation therapy. And there you can have risk organs as a three-dimensional structure inside a DICOM format. And then it could be that the vendors of radiation therapy software actually write their results into DICOM. But for imaging, I could really say that 99.9% of all the scanners in the world provide you with DICOM data. With radiation therapy, I would say it's already a lot lower. And then in DICOM RT, you can also store dose. So how much radiation dose did you give? How many times can be stored? And then what I learned, I think 2 years ago, that there's a DICOM clinical trial field. So if you do imaging in a clinical trial, you in that field could also register patients, write in the DI identification number instead of giving the patient a name. So it is actually also prepared for that. But that's usually, I've checked it then, and we do clinical trials that involve imaging, but that field is not being used. So usually then we have a paper kind of trial registration form where all this information is in, and an empty DICOM CT field. So what you can see from there is that although there is a standard, it only got traction, I would say, in the imaging world, whereas other things didn't evolve. And then it's really easy to find software that can help you read DICOM files to see the images. I think one prominent is a 3D slicer, for instance. That's an open source, or MITK. So that's just software that is around that you can download, and then you can look at the images. And then oftentimes they have a small component, it's kind of a DICOM parser, with which you can read out the real DICOM header and see what is where. And then what may also be worthwhile just noting is that there is some open source picture archive systems like Orthanc or Osiris in some sense also, that help you store and read out the images at the same time. So, but basically, if you go online, you will find many tools for both reading the DICOM header and reading DICOM images. It's really a standard that has been around for a long time, so that both for academic and non-academic use, there's a lot of open source software available. Now, the RIS actually is also a really interesting source of information, and I'll show you in a second what we used it for. What was for me very interesting, that it has the timestamps of the radiologist reporting. So I can really see when they started dictating and when they stopped. And I can see how long it took from them to the senior physician and when they signed off. We can then see how much, for instance, changed in the report from the junior physician to the senior physician. And we can then analyze, well, what did they actually change? And over years, we can analyze, did they learn? Did they have to change less or more? We can give feedback to the senior physicians if they only change things that are very unimportant, just to kind of, well, look like they're busy. So actually, the risks in the beginning seemed a very uninteresting source of information. And maybe the other thing I will just say a bit upfront, what also interested me is that when you go to a step of automating this process, people often say, well, if we do it like this or that, it's much slower than the way we work. And with these timestamps, I have a very objective measure of how fast they really are. And that is an interesting piece of information. I think for management purposes, like the whole scheduling, and you can really kind of see how people move through a department, I think the RIS is also an interesting source of data. That's the structured part. And the unstructured part, I think, is actually much bigger. And like I said, especially for research purposes, it contains everything like diagnosis, side effects, all kinds of things that are monitored using imaging. And they usually end up in an unstructured piece of text. And then there's another problem that in a hospital, all information and all databases are oriented from a patient point of view. So it's very easy for me to find, or easy, well, it's easier for me to find all the data from one patient in a search, because the database is organized in a way that I can quickly find whatever information is related to this patient. But if I want to say, well, I would like to have all the patients that had a CT, that's something you can try in any hospital. If you go to the user interface and you type in CT, it will break down, because the database behind it does not allow for a search for all CTs very easily. So it's just not made for it. If I say Bram Stieltjes for 7th of November 1974, I find all the data that belongs to me. But if I say, well, give me the 5,000 people that look similar, you will crash the system, basically. So one of the first thing you have to do is basically connect all these databases and build a search engine that inverts the view from a patient-related view on the data to, well, let's say in our case, a technical view on the data. So let's say all the CTs that look like this or that. And if you don't do that, it will be very difficult to obtain large amounts of data out of these silos. So you have to kind of free them out. And then, since a lot of it is so unstructured, actually before you can use it for any other thing, you need a curation step. So it's so dirty, basically, that you cannot hope to feed an algorithm with it, I would say, or you cannot hope to base decision-making on it in many cases. Although I think that the medically and also from a research point of view, the most interesting information is actually in these unstructured files. So basically what we've been working on, and that's the second part of the talk, is like, how do we deal with this unstructured part? And this is a screenshot of a web-based search engine that we've built. And basically we did an indexing, a rough indexing of all our risk reports using Apache Solar. And basically created a simple search on all the reports. I think that about 2 million reports or something like this that are here. So you can say fracture or no fracture, things like this. You can do a logical search here. And here you can find all kinds of other things, like all the different imaging modalities and the series description. And actually I can flap this open, and all this information actually that you see here comes from the DICOM header. So we basically reread the DICOM header and put all the information of the DICOM header in the same database, where we also have the keywords from the reports. And now I can, in the one search engine, search for, let's say, all the CT images with this resolution that have the word fracture in the report. Right? So I can already do quite a rough search, and this is instant. It just takes a second or so for the search to be finished. So if you have it, then you can start working on getting more out of images, which are also unstructured. And one thing we looked at is the staging of lung cancer. And so there are patients that are already diagnosed with the lung cancer, and they need imaging for treatment planning. That's usually what staging is about. And it's done using a combination of PET and CT. And PET is read out by radiologists, and CT is read out by nuclear medicine specialists. So it's already kind of a parallel process. And it takes quite a lot of time. And actually what I expect out of such an exam is an exact tumor formula. So there's a system called the Tumor Nodes and Metastasis, TNM, that kind of uniquely describes the current situation of a tumor before the treatment. And this is what I require to do my treatment decision making. We looked at about 400 cases of this, and basically what we saw when we looked at the reports, so we could then easily draw the reports, and only in 5% or so of all the reports, the TNM was explicitly named. So that means if you have a tumor board situation, that the person who's presenting this case has to read whatever this person saw, and then in his head kind of reconstruct what he thinks is the TNM. And then, so that takes a few minutes. And he can make mistakes. It's under pressure. It's not his patient. Normally you don't present your own patients. There's one person that presents all the patients and hasn't seen that patient before. So basically what we said is like, okay, if we know what we want in the end, why don't we define everything? And that's what you see. Sorry. What you see here. These are all the TNM labels. So here you see the T labels, T1. Here you see the N labels, so nodes, and here you see the M labels, metastasis. And basically, if I think it's about 43 labels. With the 43 labels, I describe the whole case. So I can now say, please, and this is actually a screenshot of a 3D slicer. So you can see the images. This is the PET, this is the CT here, and this is the overlaid image. And then we say, okay, to the doctor, please say what it is, and then outline it completely. So I really have a complete connection between the tumor and its label. There's no ambiguity at all anymore. And then of course people say, well, yeah, but if I read it out, then I'm much faster than you are, right? And that's, so this is again all the different labels that you would require to describe the case. And we put them in the GUI. And what we basically did is we measured, while people were doing this measurement, how long they took. And then there were, we used, this is the segmentation group. And here we have this, these timestamps, the dictation start stop, as a lower limit of how long it took people, because after the dictation it still goes to a senior physician and it takes longer. So this is kind of the lower estimate of how long it would take. And this is when the case is completely closed, so it's more or less the upper estimate. And then we also actually took 14,000 other cases of tumor staging to have yeah, a larger database. And then of course what you have to do is model people who take a little pause, go to the toilet, and so on and so on. That all gets included in the timestamp. But if you have about 15,000 cases, then you can start seeing these trends and model them out. But that's why something funny like a timestamp in the risk could be something cool to have for your project. And this is basically what we got out. So the segmentation time was about 25 minutes. And the lower bound, so the R1 estimate was about 31 minutes. So there's really not a big difference between actually radiologists reporting in terms of time and people doing a full segmentation. But if I do the full segmentation, I can guarantee a completeness, because I can actually check if the tumor formula is complete, and if not, they cannot close the case. And I have a totally structured connection between the label and where this is happening in the imaging. And this is how I hope that at least some part of the future of reporting would look like, where you just have all the findings in a comprised image, and then you can actually click on these labels and go back to the original if you still, this is the bone metastases, if you still think that it requires debate. So you can click on the overview, you have all the labels connected to the image, go back to the real image if you think that this might not be a metastasis at all. And we are now working on ways of combining first identification of these lesions and structured labeling, so that we can take even more out of these 25 minutes if you know, that people wouldn't have to segment them completely, would have to find them completely. Oh, I'm sorry for that. And that's just really a mock-up of how that could look in the future, where we maybe then have thousands and thousands of those structured cases. with features extracted from these lesions, and where we could say, well, with a high probability, this lesion is a T1 lesion or a T2 lesion because it looks like this or that, because we have a structured library of lesions lying behind it. Instead of a doctor saying, well, I've trained in this for 5 years, and I think it's T1. The depth of our, let's say, our knowledge or our patterns is very shallow. We don't remember 10,000 cases. We remember the ones that got wrong. So we have a negative bias if we did, especially with lymph nodes, for instance. If you made a mistake once and you see a small change in the lymph node, you will always say, well, it's suspicious. And it means something, because if you say it's suspicious, it needs to get biopsied. And it may be on a tricky position. So I think this is really something important to really kind of provide statistical information about the probability of something going on. Just to show a little bit about automated detection, we didn't do that for the lung tumors, but we did that for actually something that is a bit more challenging. So that's about acute abdominal pain. So that are people who come to the emergency room and may have an appendicitis or not. And that's for me like the next step is, instead of the doctor painting all these lesions or findings, we might have algorithms that already find them and the doctor corrects them. We store the corrections in a structured way again, gather a new collective, retrain the algorithm, and just get more and more of the work of the doctor out of the loop, so that they can concentrate on either difficult cases or on cases for which we don't have any algorithms anymore. And here we actually tested an algorithm that was already developed on an untouched case, basically 2 years behind each other. And this is an example of the true positive. So basically, oh, I'm sorry, that was the wrong one. So this is this black stuff is air, and it shouldn't be in the bowel, in the belly, let's say, as free air. So this is a big collection of free air that shouldn't be there. So that's usually when the bowel gets perforated, air from the bowel gets into your belly, and this is a sign of acute abdomen. And here you can see very small of these pockets. You know, they're also black, so they mean this is air. And they are connected or closely connected to this release of air from the bowel. This is where is it? I'm sorry. This is free fluid, and this is some fat reaction. And all these green boxes were not placed by us, but by the algorithm. And we can still say this is right or wrong. And the whole process takes 3 minutes from the finishing of the algorithm, of the images, to the finishing of the algorithm. And we get, again, a structured list of those boxes and their findings. We can say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and say what it could be else. And then with that, we already train or create basically the next database for a retraining of such an algorithm. There are some false positives and negatives. The most prominent one is here. That has to do with actually metal artifacts. You can see this kind of cross, and that comes from a metal implant that creates an air-like density. So you have to be careful, and that's another topic that I would also love to talk about, like data quality. So it's like, before you can do all these things, you should actually have a constant quality of data. There is ways to kind of reduce metal artifacts, and all new machines have that. So that's one thing. And that's an astonishing thing to me, is that there is no image-based quality control in radiology in Europe. You can do it, but you don't have to. And the only thing that is established is dose control in CTs. But dose control doesn't say anything about the quality of the image. Actually, it's the other way around. I always say, well, I can give you a 0-dose CT. I just put you in and out, and I give you no dose. Okay, it has also no diagnostic value. But low-dose CTs have a lower diagnostic value, and this is a trade-off. So dose optimization, which is mandatory, does not say anything about image quality that we put out. So that to me is fascinating, because we pay a lot of money for imaging, although it's not quality controlled. But that's, like I said, I can talk half an hour about what you could do to have constant image quality, which to me is kind of like the first step you should have if you look at the whole process of generating an image, extracting information out of it, and then basing diagnostic thoughts on that image. So that's images, and how you can maybe start to find them and get something structured out of images, although they are in themselves unstructured. And in reports, it's maybe also like, well, what is big data? You know, it's also a buzzword coming around, just like artificial intelligence. And for me, it's I like that definition. I don't know, I got across it. It's like, what kind of question can you ask your data very easily and get a good answer? That I think is a good kind of practical definition. It's like, if you have a good big data approach, you can ask many different questions to your data and get a reasonable answer. And if I want to, for instance, know after chemotherapy who had tumor progression or not, which is really an important question. If it's not inside a clinical study, this question I cannot answer. It's not like I can go to a console and say, okay, who had tumor progression under therapy ABC? It's impossible, because it is somewhere hidden in a longitudinal imaging series in the text. And that sounds like could be this, could be that, could be that. So this is something that then moved us to kind of say, okay, report, what does it mean? So I already told you, although we call our report structured, I would still argue that they are unstructured. But in this radiological information system, if you have a deep connection to it, at least the report has two parts, right? The impression is like the comprised part, where you kind of say what do you think that it is. So if you have the description and the impression, that's what I wanted to say. So the description is very flowery, and it has things like table tennis sized lesion or something like this, like crazy idiosyncratic ways of calling something. But usually the impression is already kind of a condensed statement. So what we did is we said, well, usually for the interesting questions, probably the impression helps us more than the description. And if you connect deeply to the RIS, you can throw away the description and only look at the impression. And then basically create, what we did is we cut, these are maybe 5 to 6 sentences, we cut them in their sentences, so that are these segments. And then we labeled these segments. And then you have labeled data, and you can start, this is actually an example of what that looks like. So you have this whole text. Here, this is the whole report. This is only the impression. We eliminate it, we cut it into sentences. And then we say, well, what does it mean? Does it mean tumor? Yes, no, maybe. So, and then we do that for about 200 cases, and we can start training an algorithm. But if you if you look at the different reports, so here we just sorted the different reports, like, okay, no tumor progression, and those that we marked as void or ambiguous, they have very similar word cloud. So like the word cloud itself does not really help you. You really have to find specific expressions. And basically that's the whole, what is hiding behind natural language processing. How do we extract things from free text? And there's tons of algorithms around for natural language processing in English. And German is a particularly confusing language for natural language processing because of the contracted words. And so if you don't have it in German, you have a problem, basically. So this is why you can maybe use existing technology as a first step, but still you would have to put quite some input in it. But I don't want to go into detail too much in that, because the next seminar will be on natural language processing, but I think it's a really important part, as long as I cannot get doctors to input their statements in a structured way. So this is what I see as part of my job, is to kind of build things or where doctors will give us a structured input. But anyone who's tried to do that in a clinical setting will know that it is a very strong psychological hurdle to do that. So I think it's smart to have let's say, a two-way approach, where you on the one hand side accept the way they work and try to make some sense out of it. And on the other hand, try to build new ways of working to avoid being pushed into the necessity of using technology like this. So to get it all together, I think I hope at least that I could give you a good overview of what kind of information you can find in radiology as a whole. I'm sure I missed a few things. What are the easy things that you could probably catch without too much effort? And what is in the more difficult part of the unstructured data, and maybe how you could get started to get something out of that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bram. With this, I would open the question session, if there are questions in the room. If there are, please do speak into the microphone so that the people online would also hear them.
You have mentioned at the end the difficulties to convince medical doctors to use structured data input. What is your experience with promising them that they get out of the structured input the report, so that they save the time for creating the report? Is this a successful way?
Yeah, thanks for that. I didn't go into that. That's I think this is the only goodie that you can offer. So we do that. Actually, we did that with the lung tumor case, where we took the labels and took the reports and said, well, okay, these expressions fit to these labels and it's doable. So I think this is a smart way of trying to entice them. I think the interesting part will be that they have really particular views on how a report should be written. So you cannot do this in a rational way, I would say, where you say, well, look like this, everything is in there. No, no, they will say, well, for me, it has to look like this. And the other will say to the same thing, no, it has to look like this. So I think that's part of the same hurdle, because if they wouldn't think like that, they would also just follow a structured input. So I think that's an interesting question. We've shown it actually to a few of the skeptic people. It's like, I can make the report look like you wrote it yourself, right? But that's a data question. You would then need either substantial data or do some smart data expansion to really make it stable. I think that also alludes to another point where we look at like, instead of just taking a random sample of reports for training, is if you can look at how different the reports are and then select your sample. So I think there are ways to do this, and I think this is the only way to go right now, although I hate it because you already have it structured, and then I destructure it for somebody's personal taste. But I think you're totally right. So we have now a report generating engine that is connected both to this I didn't show that, sorry. We've generated input fields, in this case for prostate cancer, for urologists, radiologists, and pathologists, which are, I think, the most important inputs along that trajectory. And we've built a report engine behind the forms that generates reports on the fly. So yes, I would totally say that I wouldn't see another way. And the same we did with the labeled lung data. I hope that at some point we won't have reports anymore, because I think they are just the confusion factor that doesn't really help. I think it's actually dangerous because the freedom that is there kind of hides important information to the same extent or underneath like a whole cloud of words that do not mean very much. So I think it's actually dangerous, and a lot of mistakes happen, and a lot of incompleteness happens because of that. And you know, I've been doing reports myself, and my reports were almost always very short. And I found at least that most of what other people wanted to put in is very, very speculative. And it sounds nice, but in the end, you don't answer a question. So I think it's tricky.
Any other question from the audience here in the room? Do we have online questions? So you must have been very clear, Bram. Do you have questions?
Yeah, well, I was curious why people would come to this. Is it like what were your interests, or yeah, if you could say so, or are there any things that I didn't touch upon that I could? Maybe.
You say that, yeah, there is a problem in convincing the doctor to enter the data in a structured form. I don't know if you have access to this information. Do you see a generation gap? So new generation that are more used to use whatever, computer, tablets, and so on, are more prone to enter this data? Or I don't know if you even have access to this information.
And well, no, I think it's a good point. I think the problem at the moment is that even young doctors that come with ideas are socialized in an old way, and there is currently not an alternative. So then actually I have two of these misfits in my group now, because they get spit out by a pathology department, by a radiology, because they are too experimental. And they don't want to continue work that way, and then the reaction is, okay, get them out of there, rather than change something. So if we do this the wrong way, we just re-educate a group of people that have better tools everywhere, but not in their work. And it's actually even true for, let's say, the older generation, that, you know, once this access to data when they book a flight or when they find a holiday or everywhere in their life, but don't want to change something in their work and believe that there it is impossible. It's totally amazing to me how you can think that, but it's really it's a tough nut to crack, and even a young generation could go through a socialization process that will then make them very similar. I think that's the danger. That's what we try to avoid, for instance, with the research rotations where people work on this, where I tell them, if you come out, please fight for me on the other side of the street, and just stop accepting the way we work. I think it's a really, really important component of let's say, digital transformation. It's not technical. It's really trying to convince people that the way they work is absolutely dangerous, is absolutely unnecessarily boring, and they are not, you know, profiting from advances that find their way to our life. Yeah, so I think it's actually probably one of the more important things to achieve. And I think these rotations can really help, because then people see, this is not Bram just making some PowerPoint slides, which is easy. No, it's really things we can build, and they work. They work with clinical data, not with some nicely gathered collective. And then they go out and really go back, and some actually stay. so it's really like, so I think it's really an important thing to address. It's by experience showing that this is not the way to go, and that it can be different.
We have the same discussions at Swiss TPH about the digital transformations. And one of the things I notice is, of course, that the young generation has the experience and has much different affinity to the digital aspects, and that you would actually need some training of the older generation to not hold it up. So are there sort of plans to, and then I think the older generation probably has some hesitance to show that, oh, actually, those are things that we're not very good at, and to lose their face. I really think we need to have some training also for, yeah, like the...
Yeah, but I would believe that it challenges the whole seniority concept in medicine, which is very, well, let's say innovation preventing. I think that there's a great article called Feudal Lords in Science and Medicine. I think it's already maybe 10 or 15 years old, that describes, you know, the problem that is very specific to medicine because of this hierarchical organization, and a senior to say, to go in front of his people and say, I need to learn from you, and I'm like the worst case of all of us in a sense, would, I think, in many departments almost be unthinkable. Which I think is for me, it would be no problem. I would take the head of radiology and educate him a little bit, and he's very open comparatively. I've in this digital diagnostic department, I pushed for digitalization in pathology, and there were discussions like, well, but now the worst thing that can happen is when my lamp breaks and I can replace it myself. What if those computers break? Right, in terms of like moving from looking at glass slides or going digital, it's like, yeah. So I think there's a huge gap for re-education, and the older, the more, I would say. But I would really think that I also don't like this hierarchical organization of medicine for obvious reasons. And I think that is actually the thing that, if you address that, the other thing is not a problem anymore, in a sense.
Do we have any more questions in the room? If not, thank you again for a great, interesting talk, Bram. And I will give you some time, 12 minutes to the hour. Have a great afternoon. See you soon. Thank you.